Welcome one and all to tonight's talk, which is Clubland's Hidden Treasures by the Reverend Sam Aldred. The talk is based on Sam's book, Clubland's Hidden Treasures, which lifts the lid on London's Clubland, a world populated by princes, prostitutes, prime ministers, and prize pigs. It answers such questions as, who gave the Caledonian Club a snuff box made from a taxidermied ram's head? Why is there a suit of armour in the bar of the East India? And what is Napoleon's death mask doing in the Library of Books? And if we just say a little bit about Sam and his rather unique CV. So on leaving university, Sam worked as a perfume salesman in Kazakhstan, a schoolmaster in Brighton, and then he entered the church. And I think maybe with a CV like that, Sam's maybe got his second book. I'm sure there's a story or two there to be told. He's also been dubbed, for good or for ill, the Vicar of Vice by Idler magazine. The talk will last for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. If you can submit your questions using the chat function as we go along, I'll put them to Sam at the end of his talk. I'll also give you some details at the end of the talk on how you can obtain copies of Clubland's Hidden Treasures, signed by Sam, and delivered to your door. So without further ado, sit back, enjoy, and over to Sam.
Hello, thank you very much for that introduction. I've got a little presentation, so I'll put that up now, if I can figure it out. There we are. Right, so thank you very much, and it is a great pleasure to be here this evening. I've been giving these talks in support of Clubland's Hidden Treasures since the book was published in September last year. But this is the first I've delivered not to a club, but to a livery guild. And livery land, if I may call it that, is something of a mystery to me. I was just saying that I attended a dinner with the parish clerks a few years back, which was rather jolly. But I'm only just beginning to educate myself about the history of the guild system, and the sort of fascinatingly arcane and wonderfully rich history. I've just made a rather audacious purchase of a book on the ceremonial barges of the River Thames, which I'm looking forward to getting my teeth into. And I'm sure you have many magnificent treasures within your hall. And hopefully one day, when we're allowed to live again, I might even be permitted to come and take a peek. So my thanks to Erin Wirtz, whose idea this was, to Phil Elder and to Lucy McCord, who have mastered the techno wizardry which has made this evening possible. It's always much more fun, of course, to do these things in person, but we must make do, and it's good to be here, even if it must be digitally. So I'd like to give you an overview of my subject, which is clubs and their treasures, before focusing in on a few items from my research, which I found especially interesting. I've tried to include a range of objects, and as a nod to your profession, I've included both of the books which feature in Clubland's Hidden Treasures. And then at the end, as Phil said, there should be time for a few questions. So as anyone who has ever written an essay will have been told, we must begin by defining our terms. What is Clubland and what are its treasures? According to the standard definition, Clubland is that cluster of clubs centred on St James's. I've got a little map here to help us. There we are, which branches out to Mayfair and Knightsbridge and has its bohemian fringes in Soho and Chelsea. But I find that geographical definition to be rather limiting, because although it is a distinctively English invention, Clubland has outposts all over the world. There are clubs scattered across the United States, and I'll focus on one example from there in just a few minutes. There are clubs in Australia and India, in Singapore and Canada. Just about everywhere the British visited, they brought with them the things they loved the most: competitive sports, Anglicanism, tea drinking, and clubs. So if not by geography, how else might we seek to define Clubland? There is undoubtedly a certain style associated with clubs. The very word conjures up a mental image of leather armchairs and suet puddings, of retired colonels in rebarbative tweeds, snoring assertively in dusty libraries. And in certain cases, this isn't perhaps too far off the mark. But within Clubland, we find great stylistic diversity. Take the clubhouses. We see handsome Georgian townhouses, sprawling Gothic mansions, and purpose-built, labour-saving modern buildings, like those occupied by the Royal Thames Yacht Club or the New Club of Edinburgh. Some clubs, such as the Beefsteak and Pratt's, occupy little more than single rooms. The RAC, on the other hand, is gargantuan. It has 3 restaurants, a swimming pool, a Turkish sauna, and its own private post office. When it was opened in 1911, Thomas Sopwith, the aviation pioneer, declared that it looked like a bloody great railway station, and he resigned his membership forthwith. The same diversity can be found among the members. If you'll permit the generalization, the Athenaeum is full of bishops, and therefore I would suggest best avoided. The Savage, hard-drinking bohemians. The Carlton, Tory party grandees. And the Flyfishers, well, flyfishers. And when one takes in the media moguls of Black's Club and the artistic throng of the Chelsea Arts Club, we see a population very much more diverse than our metaphorical snoring colonels. And nor do our clubs share a common point of origin. White's on St James's Street is the Club. It was founded in the 17th century when there was still a Stuart on the throne. Brooks's and Boodle's are 18th century foundations, as is the New Club of Edinburgh, the Norfolk Club, and the Liverpool Athenaeum, which predates its more famous London namesake by about 20 years. The Travellers' Club was inspired by the Congress of Vienna, inspired both by its booziness and the spirit of international concord that it fostered. There are 2 clubs brought about by the Great Reform Act, the Reform to bolster it, and the Carlton to oppose it. Bucks and the Nottingham Service Club are both products of the First World War, and Black's was founded as late as 1992 as an archly postmodern inversion of White's. No clubs of note have yet to come out of the 21st century, however, which has got off to a decidedly unclubbable start. So there we are. Clubland is not to be defined geographically, architecturally, stylistically, or temporally. But for all this prevarication, one knows exactly when one is within the bounds of Clubland. If you'll forgive the pretension, I'm going to quote a philosopher to get to my point. The late Sir Roger Scruton described clubs as being a corporate person housed in a sacred precinct. I think that gets to the heart of it. A club is not a pub. It is not a restaurant or a hotel. It is not a mere service provider. A club is a home from home, and so its members are a sort of family from family. In a club, one can strike up a conversation with another member, safe in the knowledge that you both have a shared stake in your surroundings. And as with a much-loved and rather grand family home, clubs become repositories of memories, places to commemorate family heroes and to retell their legends down through the generations. And that brings us, more or less neatly, onto our second definition, treasures. I employ the term in the book very widely. Some of the objects are genuine treasures. There are portraits by famous artists worth, I'm sure, a very great deal of money. Others are treasures in only a very personal sense. The relationship between clubs and their treasures is as old as Clubland itself. The very earliest clubs commissioned arcane artefacts for ceremonial purposes. The Society of Dilettanti, whose spectacular pictures now hang in Brooks's, began to meet in 1732. In its early years, whenever a gentleman was elected to membership, the president donned a white toga and admitted the postulant while sitting on a throne of crimson velvet. The dilettante's treasures include a ballot box, carved to resemble a Greek temple, with the ballot balls deposited between the open legs of the female figure of justice, and also a casket of Honduran mahogany and ivory, known as the Tomb of Bacchus, which is in reality a sort of glorified piggy bank. And both of these objets d'art are still displayed when the society gathers for its, I'm told, extremely convivial dinners. Since these pioneering days, the clubs of Great Britain have continued to accumulate both priceless works of art and also the most peculiar pieces of tat. And there are quite as many examples of the latter as there are of the former. Witness the story of Major Hope Johnston of the Pelican Club, long since defunct, who found himself so mired in gambling debts that he was driven to sell his fine set of moustaches and beard, of which he was inordinately proud, to Lord Esme Gordon for the sum of £5. Lord Esme removed Hope Johnston's facial fluff with a pair of scissors, mounted his quarry on purple velvet, and displayed it in the clubhouse beside his other sporting trophies. The Pelicans always were a boisterous bunch. On one occasion, a member was accused of having tossed a boar's head at a peer of the realm, sending him crashing into the fireplace. "Nonsense," the defendant protested. "I've thrown nothing but jelly all evening." Now, clubmen may throw food, but they do not throw things away. If something has been in a clubhouse for long enough, then it will be there until the last syllable of recorded time. It does not matter how unfashionable a painting may be, or how gruesome a piece of taxidermy, for it is a holy relic, and to remove it would be a form of sacrilege. The majority of these treasures are presented to the club by devoted members wishing to preserve something of themselves. Animals they shot, art they made, books they wrote, that sort of thing. Some are commissioned to mark special occasions in the life of the club. To commemorate its 150th anniversary, my own club, the Savile, amended the ceiling of its ballroom, which is covered in a rather, shall we say, enthusiastic Baroque scene, so that one of the cherubs now clutches in his chubby hand a bottle of club champagne. Other treasures are accrued in more unexpected ways. In the Cavalry and Guards Club, for example, one can find a 16th century leather shoe. This was found in the attic of a former guards clubhouse and has been with the club ever since, despite having nothing to do with the club or any of its members. Why not? Right, so enough background. What I'd like to do now is to go a little deeper into some of these treasures, and I've chosen a little selection of what I hope are a few perhaps less well-known items, and depending on timings, we'll see how many I cover. So, I'd like to start with something that's a true holy relic of Clubland. It links the very earliest clubs, of which only a handful survive, with the great Victorian heyday of club building. This is the gridiron, which hangs in the Beefsteak Club. It used to be said that the beefsteak was so exclusive that its members needed to be a relation of God, and a damned close relation at that. There is an old story, apparently true in part, which illustrates the point. In 1900-something, the beefsteak was raided by police following a tip that it was the front for a brothel. An inspector gained entry and found 4 respectable-looking gentlemen dining at a long table. "And who might you be?" demanded the inspector of the first man. "I am the Lord Chancellor," came the reply. "Aha, and you, sir?" "The Archbishop of Canterbury." "Oh yes, and the next?" "I am the Governor of the Bank of England." "And I suppose you're the Prime Minister?" "As a matter of fact, I am," replied Arthur Balfour. The Beefsteak's clubhouse on Irving Street is modest by the standards of Clubland. There are a couple of bedrooms for country members, but the main body of the club is a single room furnished with prints of old members, that long table, and a few ubiquitous leather armchairs. Dominating the room is a gridiron, pictured here. It is a stark and emaciated object, blackened and slightly crooked, and it is perhaps the oldest of Clubland's many treasures, and here, in brief, is its story. The current Beefsteak Club was founded in 1876, but it traces its origins back to a far earlier club. The Sublime Society of Beefsteaks, or such was its glorious name, was founded around the year 1735. Details of the club's inception are hard to come by, but it took place at the Theatre Royal in Covent Garden. In the earliest version of the story, the scene painter George Lambert took to cooking in his studio, as he was too busy to eat elsewhere. Lambert favoured grilled beef and plenty of it, and soon the enticing odours emanating from the studio began to attract the attention of others around the theatre, and Lambert began sharing his beef with all of those who stopped by. It was suggested that these meals become a regular affair, and so the Sublime Society of Beefsteaks was born, and Lambert's gridiron became its emblem. Membership was, at first, limited to 24, and drawn from the leading artists, actors, and musicians of the day. William Hogarth and Samuel Johnson were both members, and a smattering of royalty added respectability. The Sublime Society employed elaborate regalia and rituals, intended as an irreverent parody of masonry. The members wore blue jackets and buff waistcoats with brass buttons stamped with that gridiron and the motto, "Beef and Liberty." I've always thought that's a sort of policy platform that everyone can get behind, apart from vegetarians, I suppose. The club's officers included the president for the day, the bishop, the recorder, and Boots. Boots was always the club's most junior member, a general dog's body charged with waiting on the others. If Boots showed any sign of his discontent with his treatment, then he was marched out of the room by two members carrying halberds and a third with a ceremonial sword, and he was given a ticking off by the recorder. He was then wrapped in the garment of repentance, it was the tablecloth, and permitted to return. The Duke of Sussex was Boots between 1808 and 1809, and he was bullied spectacularly by the other members. The original clubhouse burned down in 1808. What was supposedly Lambert's original gridiron was found in the wreckage, miraculously preserved. The gridiron was displayed in the Sublime Society's new clubhouse at the Old Lyceum Theatre until 1830, when that building also burned down. And whether these fires had anything to do with the drunken grilling of beef is not recorded. The theatre was rebuilt in 1838 with a special suite of rooms for the beefsteaks. The gridiron, which had once again been rescued from the charred remains of the former clubhouse, now formed the centre ornament of the dining room ceiling. Soon after this latest move, the Sublime Society of Beefsteaks began to lose its vigour. The Victorians looked askance at the frivolous rituals of the 18th century dining clubs. And so in 1867, after 2 decades of decline, the Sublime Society was finally wound up. The current Beefsteak Club was founded 9 years later, and shorn of its faux Masonic ceremonies, it still had its quirks, notably that all its waiters are called Charles. The Beefsteaks clubhouse on Irving Street was purpose-built, and a design of gridirons is cleverly interposed into the high-pitched roof. There are a few knickknacks of note, including some pieces of silver from the old Sublime Society, but the club's greatest treasure is the gridiron that tradition says once belonged to George Lambert. It is a link to Clubland's raucous, nascent days, before the deadening hand of respectability wagged its censorious finger and hushed the sound of silliness for silliness' sake. So this next item takes us across the Atlantic Ocean to the Tavern Club of Boston. And in the book, I've limited myself to British clubs, but I thought this was too sweet an item not to share with you, and it's only a short story. This illustration is actually linked to the Fruin Club of Oxford. I should say all the illustrations are from the book, and they were done by my infuriatingly talented sister-in-law, Buffy, who has a doctorate in chemistry, but she's also an illustrator. There we are. So the treasure in question is an arts and crafts punch bowl, which has a peculiar backstory. North American clubs tend towards 2 extremes. The first type is large, businesslike, and Anglophile. The second is smaller, literary, and unmistakably Yankee. Founded in 1884, the Tavern Club of Boston belongs firmly in the latter camp. The club's social life revolves around weekly dinner discussions, which are witty, occasionally heated affairs. A propensity towards the light-hearted, even to the silly, is perhaps best illustrated by the club's decision early in its life to purchase a performing bear cub from a passing circus. 25 members each chipped in $1 and brought the beast back to the clubhouse, to the great amusement of their fellow members. The length of the bear's residency is not recorded, but suffice it to say, it was about as long as it was successful. Neighbours, whom we may assume were already unhappy about having a club of boisterous gentlemen congregating in their neighbourhood, were quick to object to the inhuman noises and odours emanating from the tavern's clubhouse. Taken more seriously was the reaction of Julius, the club servant, to the suggestion of one member that, quote, this faithful servitor should be dressed in a highly picturesque Spanish costume for the special purpose of leading the bear on a chain onto the city's famous common and exercising him there. Taking care of a bear cub was not as easy as the clubman had apparently assumed. So shortly after its purchase, the members took the difficult decision to sell the animal back to the circus for a loss. Easy come, easy go. The poor creature had not been around long enough even to acquire a name. Nevertheless, the club's brief period as a one-bear menagerie made a lasting impression. A few weeks later, a dinner was held at the club, during which the bear was declared to be the tavern club's official totem. Soon the clubhouse began filling up with bear figurines, bear paintings, and other ursine ephemera. The members to this day wear bears on their ties, and they even have little bear medallions, which they wear with their evening dress. Finest of all of these treasures was the very first item to be purchased. What money could be recouped from the sale of the creature was used to purchase a sizable Canton china punch bowl, and this was felt to be a much more practical investment for the new club. The punch bowl was encased in a copper outer shell designed by George Prentice Kendrick. A leading figure in the Boston arts and crafts movement, Kendrick has work in both the New York Met and London's V&A. The shell is decorated with a design of twisting grapevines and two bears holding a shield bearing the Tavern Club logo. Today, the bowl is cracked and unusable, but it has been retained together with its handsome copper casing and has pride of place on a specially erected shelf in the dining room. And there, from that elevated position, it may remind diners that no matter what regrettable decisions they may have made that day, none will be quite as short-sighted as the time in 1885 when 25 Bostonians clubbed together to purchase a performing bear cub to install in their club. Right, so back to our side of the pond now, and I'd like to dip into a different sort of treasure from White's, the world's longest lived club. And this is the first of the two books which I promised I've included as a special sop to my audience. Now, White's does not need much of an introduction. As the great Anthony Lejeune has written, the fact remains that all other London clubs, one is tempted to say all the other clubs in the world, have generally and generously been prepared to acknowledge that White's is special. Although Lejeune was a member of White's, so he's probably biased. The item on which I'd like to focus is the club's infamous betting book. Whilst not much to look at, when prized open, it reveals pearls of great price. Volumes of White's betting book date back to 1743, and there was actually an even earlier volume, but that was destroyed by fire 10 years previously. And actually that fire appears in Hogarth's Rake's Progress. The firemen tackling the blaze received personal encouragement from King George II, but alas, to no avail. In the club's Georgian heyday, the betting book was notable for the vastness and for the inventiveness of the members' wages. The aristocracy were far richer in the mid-18th century than they had been a generation previously, and they had access to generous credit from a growing number of established banks. Flush with cash, the members of White's bet on anything and everything. They bet on births and deaths, on horses and divorces, on battles and hangings, on the strength of earthquakes and the pronunciation of French nouns, even on one famous occasion on which of two raindrops would be the first to reach the windowsill, with £3,000 at stake, and that's about £170,000 in today's money. One contemporary commented of White's membership that they were not religious, but had any member become clairvoyant and announced the imminent sounding of the last trump, a book at once would have been opened on the event, with side bets taken on which of the archangels would be the one to sound it. Whilst many of the bets were frivolous, some were downright immoral. Horace Walpole told the story of a man who fell ill on St. James's Street. The members of White's immediately began to take bets on whether he was alive or dead. When it was proposed that the man's blood be taken, those who had betted on his being dead objected, arguing that this would prejudice the fairness of the wager. Walpole told another, even more disturbing tale. One of the youths at White's, he recorded, betted £1,000 that a man could live 12 hours underwater. He hired a desperate fellow, sunk him in a ship by way of experiment, and both ship and man have not appeared since. And the terrible thing is, this man repeated the experiment again. In 1756, Walpole and some of his chums produced a piece of heraldic satire for the club, a bas-relief version of which may be found in the front hall. So I'm not a heraldry buff, so forgive me if I mispronounce some of these terms, and this is what you're looking at here. But Walpole described the symbolism thus. The blazon is vert for a card table, 3 paroles proper on a chevron sable for a hazard table, 2 rouleaux and saltire between 2 dice proper, a white ball for election, argent. The supporters are an old and young knave of clubs. The crest, an arm out of an earl's coronet, shaking a dice box. And the motto, oh sorry, I've gone on too far. The motto is Cogit amor numi, the love of money compels. Around the arms is a claret bottle ticket by way of order. As the 19th century dawned, the quality of wagers at White's had stagnated. They became neither so ambitious and nor so ruinous. As with the beefsteak, this marked the passing of old bohemian aristocratic clubland and the rise of a new, more respectable and more middle-class clubland, which coincided with the ascent of Victoria to the throne. As that great fictional cad Harry Flashman put it, the age of the Corinthian, the plunger, and the dandy was giving way to that of the prig, the preacher, and the bore. Nevertheless, White's has weathered all of these storms. It is still standing on St. James's, it's still perhaps the most exclusive club in the world, and new volumes of its betting book continue to be filled. So for this next item, we're going to the Savage Club, and the picture I've got is of the National Liberal Club, where the Savage are currently resident. But I've heard, and this might just be scurrilous gossip, but I think they're being kicked out. So I don't know if they might be homeless by the end of this year, but as I say, don't take my word on that. So the Savage Club is a fortress of old London bohemianism. Its emblem features a Native American chieftain brandishing a tomahawk. The members, who refer to each other as Brother Savage, are a hard-drinking, raucous bunch. This outlandishness is only emphasised by the fact that the Savage currently resides at the National Liberal, which is one of the more abstemious and progressive London clubs. Founded in 1853, the Savage began as a gathering of literary men. Various names were thrown about to try and capture the club's literary flavour. These included the Addison, the Johnson, and the Goldsmith. However, when someone was so bold as to suggest the Shakespeare, another member cried out in frustration. Don't let's be pretentious. If we must have a name, let it be a modest one. A third member thereby suggested the Savage, Richard Savage, having been a notorious producer of squalid verse, whose greatest claim to fame was that he had once killed a man in a brawl. The name was generally agreed to be a sound one, and so the Savage Club was born. Two savages, who excelled in very different fields, are commemorated in the clubhouse. Sir Alexander Fleming's Nobel Medal can be seen in a display case, and Sir Charlie Chaplin's cane hangs above the bar. Other famous savages have included James McNeill Whistler, Sir Henry Irving, Sir Edward Elgar, J.M. Barry, P.G. Woodhouse, and more royal dukes than you could, in good conscience and without fear of committing treason, shake a stick at. Compared to these luminaries, it may seem strange that the member whose memory looms largest in Savage Club folklore was at best a mediocrity. Edwin Jehoshaphat Odell, for that was his improbable name, was a second-rate character actor who could barely have been called a gentleman, and who was certainly not, in the conventional sense, a good clubman. He was, however, a fine example of that peculiar breed, the club eccentric. Old Odell, as he was known, is commemorated at the Savage in oils and marble, but his memory lives on most vividly in the chair from which he presided over club affairs for more than 40 years. It is not the most famous chair in Clubland. The Athenaeum has Faraday's wheelchair, the Carlton displays Disraeli's chair from the Congress of Berlin. The Travellers was given Thackeray's celebrated cane-bottomed chair, and the Garrick has the seat on which Henry Irving died. This is, though, the most infamous chair in Clubland. A history of the Savage Club, written in 1907, when Odell was still alive, notes that he was a man of uncertain age. He had been entertained to dinner on his 70th, his 80th, and his 1904th birthdays. All of these birthdays were comprised within 10 years, and the 70th came only the other day. Odell was a constant thorn in the side of the Savage Club committee. He barely spent a penny of his own money, but rather sit in his chair close to the bar, wearing his customary black sombrero and cloak, and he would scrounge Irish whiskey and cigars from his fellow members. And woe to anyone who offered him a cigarette, he would reply, "I do not smoke stationery." His fellow savages regarded Odell as a totem of the savage spirit, and they backed him against his foes at every turn. Eventually reduced to penury, the savages petitioned King Edward VII, who was a brother savage, to exercise his right to nominate Odell as a poor brother of the Charterhouse. The royal savage agreed, and Odell moved into the Charterhouse in 1908, and he never left again. Odell's greatest performance came in 1928, when he repaid the late king's generosity by behaving atrociously to one of his relatives. In this year, the Duke of York attended a dinner at which he was elected an honorary life member. The Duke was treated to a typical programme of entertainments, including a Shakespearean soliloquy by Odell. After his performance, the vain old actor left to find a drink elsewhere, refusing to watch any of the other turns. He returned to the Savage about 11 p.m. Thrusting his way cantankerously through the crowd, Odell headed towards his customary chair, only to find that it was occupied by the newly elected royal savage. Livid with rage and waving his arms wildly, Odell shouted, "Out of my chair, sir! Get out at once!" The Duke obliged, removing himself apologetically to the bar, making the customary throne available to the obviously eccentric patriarch. This was to be Odell's last great show. He died 4 months later. And after the old devil had been buried, his brother savages affixed to that same chair a plaque in his memory. It states, plainly but affectionately the facts of the matter. Here old Odell sat. In all their subsequent moves, the chair has followed the savages, and it remains among their most treasured possessions. It stands as a reminder that, in Clubland, sheer pig-headed longevity counts for more than birth, titles, manners, or money. And let that be a cautionary tale for any royal dukes who might be in the audience. I'll now turn to my final object for this evening, which dwells in the Athenaeum. The Athenaeum is a club in which gentlemen join to read rather than to get rosy-faced, where members prefer to be left undisturbed behind the church Times rather than to play French cricket with the on-sex umbrella. It is, in short, a serious club. Its clubhouse is one of the most recognisable buildings in London, a noble neo-Grecian structure overlooking St James's Park, encircled by a classical frieze and surmounted by a golden statue of the goddess Athene, who looks as though she's conducting a pagan ubi et orbi for the tourists below. The architect, Decimus Burton, was only 24 when he received the commission, which does rather make one consider one's life choices. The Ath, as it's known, was conceived in 1824 by John Wilson Croker, the author, bruiser, and secretary of the Admiralty. It was instituted, he said, for the association of individuals known for their scientific and literary attainments, artists of eminence in every class of the fine arts, and noblemen and gentlemen distinguished as liberal patrons. Whilst such men would form the basis of many later clubs, this marked a departure from the more resolutely aristocratic clubs of the 18th century, dedicated principally, as we've heard, to gambling and consuming heroic quantities of beefsteak. The Athenaeum soon became known as the club to join for the chronically big-brained. Charles Dickens was elected to membership on the same day as Charles Darwin. To date, there have been 52 Nobel Prize winners among the membership, including at least one in each category. As Anthony Lejeune comments, the Athenaeum has a formidable reputation for intellectuality, gravity, deep respectability, and episcopacy. And indeed, there was a time in the early 20th century when one could hardly move for bishops avoiding their diocese and ignoring their clergy. Surely it is no coincidence that this was a great age for the established church. And this episcopal quality has not always been popular with other members. Abraham Hayward is said to have complained, "I see the bishops beginning to swarm. The atmosphere is alive with them. Every moment I expect to find one dropping into my soup." In homage to the Athenaeum's men of letters, therefore, our object of interest takes the form of a cloth-bound tome which can be found in the drawing room. And this is the Athenaeum's question book, a sort of proto-Google in which members pose questions to be answered by their peers. There are no previous volumes. The tradition only began in 1963. It was the brainchild of Miss Penhaligon, the indomitable club librarian, and was no doubt instituted in order to dissuade members from directing their queries at her. The very first entry in the book, by a Mr. J.M. Ross, concerns the origins of the game of nine men's Morris, and this sets the tone admirably for what follows, which can best be characterised as eclectic. Some of my favourite entries include, what is the significance of the toad in Sicily? Answer, they contain the souls of the proud. Why do sumo wrestlers shave their legs? Answer, for the pure beauty of it. And do bananas grow in the USSR? No. Some questions remain unanswered. Others receive a response long after the author has ceased to be troubled by their entry. A question from 1975 asking about the decline in snuff taking was only answered in 1985 by a member who had been offered some that evening. Some questions are clearly phrased to cause a stir. In 1989, the notorious priest Father Brian Brindley asked which nations typify the 7 deadly sins. And it is prudent not to record the answers suggested by one member for fear of upsetting any Scottish, Iranian, Japanese, French, German, American or Russian listeners. And incidentally, that same cleric, Canon Brian Dominic Frederick Titus Leo Brindley, died at the Athenaeum during a 7-course dinner held to celebrate his 70th birthday. He suffered a massive heart attack between the dressed crab and the beurre en croûte. Sadly, over the last 20 years, the question book has fallen out of use. Like high street travel agents and pornographic cinemas, it has been superseded by the internet. And this is a great loss to Clubland, although there is now an easier way to source answers to one's questions. This is surely a case of quantity over quality. I know that I would trust the considered opinion of a perspicacious Athenian over that of a pustulous teenager. Besides, as one member observes, many surfers of the internet are unclubbable. So we've now reached a juncture where I want to keep on talking, and this is the besetting sin of the clergy. I could talk about the axe wielded by William Gladstone in the National Liberal, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's snooker cue, which has a ghostly connection at the Harrogate Club, the betting boxes of the Norfolk Club. I've just discovered a new wonderfully eccentric treasure in the Players Club of New York, but perhaps this is a good time, if Phil thinks, we could turn now to some questions.
Oh, thank you very much, Sam. Very, very interesting indeed. If I can just encourage everybody to send their questions in now. But we had a question submitted from Robert Marr. He says, I'm a member of the Reform and through a friend make use of the National Liberal Club. I'd be interested in the history of how the National Liberal Club came about and how it was intended to differ from the Reform and their role in politics.
Right, yeah, that's a good question. There's a sort of liberal corner of Clubland which began with Brooks's, and the item I've included about Brooks's is Napoleon's death mask, and there was actually quite a lot of support for Napoleon in the early days of his career. When the Reform Club was founded, as I say, to support the Reform Act of 1832, it was intended to be less Whiggish than Brooks's and more liberal, this being a distinction within the liberal movement at that time. And so it was still quite an aristocratic club, but more as I say, liberal rather than Whiggish. And indeed, the one liberal wrote that the Whigs were of hideous sight and pestiferous smell, and therefore they needed to have their own club. Rather rude, but there we are. So the National Liberal was then founded in the late 1880s, I think, and it was intended to be a more democratic and less aristocratic club. And it was founded, it was the idea of William Gladstone, and he founded it specifically that it would be a less sort of boozy, closed-off club. Instead, you had this huge club, and it's by some, it was at the time the biggest club by some distance. So the idea is it would be open to anyone who marched under the banner of popular liberalism, I think was how he put it. Well, William Gladstone being a rather dour figure, I don't think he intended people to have a great deal of fun there. And I think the bar was only put in after the Second World War. So that's the sort of history of those three clubs which have been dedicated to the liberal movement in its various guises. So I hope that answers the question.
In fact, you were saying about the Savage Club is maybe going to have to move from the National Liberal Club. And I've got a feeling that they've never actually been good friends. That if you're a member of the Savage Club, you can use any of the facilities of the National Liberal Club. If you're a member of the National Liberal Club, you can't go into the Savage unless you have an invite.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult situation really, and there's quite a lot of clubs like this that have I don't know, fallen on hard times, or particularly after the Second World War, a lot of clubs amalgamated, and you get some sort of unhappy marriages. My favourite is, I think, the 1950s, the Bath Club and the Conservative clubs amalgamated, and the resulting Franken Club was called, nicknamed the Lavatory. It was quite funny.
We have a question from Sue Pandit. Which of these clubs still don't allow women members?
That's a good question. It's probably, so I've got 38 clubs in the end. I wanted 40, but 2 wouldn't let me, so I've got 38. Of that number, probably 10, I would say, don't. And it's an interesting mixture. It tends to be the most exclusive clubs of so Brooks's, Whites, and Boodles don't. And then also some provincial clubs, which tend to be like the Frewin Club of Oxford, which when I lived in Oxford, I used that as a reciprocal from my own club. And it's a bit like a sort of quite an old-fashioned working men's club vibe almost, but they're still lads only. And my own club, the Savile, is still men only. Although an interesting sort of footnote there, one member transitioned from being a man to being a woman, and so there was a vote on whether they could still continue to be a member, and it was decided that as there'd been a man when they joined, they could still continue. But yes, that's an interesting case study. But yes, increasingly I think that most clubs switched in the somewhere between the 70s and the noughties, and it's really a small number of the total which are now single sex.
Mike James asks, where did your interest in Clubland start?
Well, that's a good question. I suppose I've always been interested in institutions which they accumulate stuff, and I like the idea of being part of something which is bigger than any single generation. One of the things I love so much about the church, in fact, the idea you're stepping into a heritage which is, in the church's case, certainly universal and eternal, and knowing that something will be there long after you're gone. I joined the Oxford and Cambridge Club when I worked in Kazakhstan, because I'm from Worcestershire, and that's where my parents are from, and I would be back in London not infrequently for meetings, and so it was nice to have a sort of a base. I was at Oxford as an undergrad, and that was where I got the bug, really, and then I sort of learned a bit about the history, and a friend took me along to the Savile Club, and it was just so fun, and I met all these magnificent people, newspaper editors and Air Force pilots and authors and actors, and I thought, wow, this is great, I want to be a member here. So I petitioned and was eventually allowed to join. And that's where the interest came from.
John Scott asks, does home house qualify? I'm
going to confess my absolute ignorance here. I don't know what that is. Can you fill me in?
If I remember rightly, it's a club that's just off Baker Street. Right. So to me personally, I would say yes, it does. It's a very nice club, and it is kind of mildly eccentric. So I would say it qualifies perfectly for a London club.
That's great. I mean, I have to say, the difficulty, two difficulties twofold. One, I don't live in London. I haven't actually lived in London for 7 years now or something. And so, I'm married with a child. Before that, I was in seminary, and so I didn't have all the time I'd like to go. So that's one problem. The other thing is there are so many of these wonderful clubs, and you've got to know where to draw the boundaries. And so, you've got dining clubs and drinking clubs, and there's some wonderful sort of student clubs as well. So, I mean, certainly I reached a point where I just thought, right, I want to get this out. I've got quite a lot of material, and I want to get it published. But definitely there are, I'm sure, as many clubs again that I could also include. So thank you for that.
In fact, the questions are coming in thick and fast. So, have you any tales of the rise and decline of the Bath Club?
That's easily answered. No. I'm afraid I did. I'm sure I read something about it, but I can't dredge my mind for it right now. So come back to me another time.
Okay. What treasures have you found in the Eccentric Club?
So the Eccentric, I addressed the Eccentric Club a month ago or so, and they, as I'm sure some of you all know, they don't have their own clubhouse anymore, and so they sold off almost all their stuff when the club disbanded in the 1980s. A sad example of a loss of a club. The item I've included is now in the bar of the East India Club, and it's a clock. They have the owl as their image, and an owl with a clock in its talons. That was their image, and it is their image again. And it's a clock that goes backwards, and that the numbers are also printed in a mirror image. So it's completely useless as a clock. And there was one of these in their clubhouse. And then when that club disbanded, members were given membership. If they so wished, they could transfer to the East India Club, which some did. And so they got a replica of that clock made, which is in the bar of the East India now. So I think that their president, who is the man I mentioned who transitioned from the Savile Club, he's their president of the Eccentric Club. He is collecting various bits and bobs that he can get his hands on in auctions, but that clock is the only real thing that exists within the bounds of Clubland now.
Tony John Ash asks, Sam, it's a fascinating lecture. Presumably the clubs are as poignant as ever.
As poignant?
But I presume it's also as relevant as ever, that they're still as well supported as ever.
They went through a very bad, as far as I understand it, Clubland reached its nadir in the 1970s, really, when it was sort of deeply unpopular to be a member of a club. And you had these huge clubhouses, which were falling memberships, older members. They weren't recruiting, and that's when a lot closed, really. Things have really picked up, I think, since the 1990s. And so my own club and several other clubs I know have long waiting lists, and they are very well supported and have a fairly youthful membership now. However, in the provinces, and I've included about 8 clubs outside of London. The picture's a bit less rosy, and it tends to be an older membership, a bit more stuck in its ways. So it's it's a mixed bag, and I know that the Naval Club has just announced that it's closing, and that's a shame. I think it hadn't been doing too well for a while again in terms of income, and so they're closing. So there are still closures happening, which is still shame. Of course, COVID has, as all these things, has been a real terrible blow. So I think the picture's rather less rosy now than it was a year and a half ago. But in general, I think things are looking better than they were 30, 40 years ago.
I think I read somewhere it was saying about, just picking up the point you made about more youthful members, that it's because property prices in London are so high. People are tending to live at home with their parents. Younger people live at home with the parents, but they don't want to be at home with the parents all the time. They want somewhere else to go to that they can call home. And for that reason, clubs are becoming a lot more popular with the younger people.
I think that sort of rings true. And I did that thing that everyone does when you move to London. I lived, when I left Kazakhstan, I lived in a horrible flat by Clapham Junction, which I shared about 6 other people. And it was damp, and it had mildew and bugs. And I just went to the Oxford and Cambridge Club, whenever I had time to do so, because it was lovely, and I could get tea and coffee or have a pint and read a book. And so I think that certainly rings true, I think.
Robert McClellan's is encouraging you to do a similar project on the livery companies, and it's suggesting that you could start with their initial item, which is the station as a very own Wicked Bible. So I don't know if you know of the Wicked Bible, but I don't need to tell you, but there's 10 commandments, it's commandment number 7, thou shalt not commit adultery, and the not got left out, so thou shalt commit adultery.
I have heard of such Bibles, but I didn't know any were, so that's wonderful. That's great. So thank you very much for that. I was just saying again to to Phil and Lucy before everyone came in, that I like to have a writing project, and there are so many of these wonderful institutions, and say particularly the livery companies and the Inns of Court. I think that would be an interesting next volume. These magnificent sort of survivals which need support and have so many fascinating things in them.
I think we've got time for maybe just 2 more questions. So Christopher Smith asks, if you're not a member of the Savile Club, which club would you wish to join and why?
I thought about sort of thing. I do think about, because I've been around so many now. I really like Bucks Club, which is it's small, very friendly. It's where the Bucks Fizz comes from, which is a great contribution to humankind and the good of humanity. And when I went there with a friend of mine, they had no vegetarian items on their menu, and I thought that this is probably a sign of a good sort of club. And it's a very handsome building as well. So I like Bucks, and the other one I really like is the Oriental. And I'm lucky that I get weekend use of the Oriental through the Savile Club. So sometimes when I'm down on a Saturday, I'll go to the Oriental, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful Adam-esque clubhouse. And they do a belting curry, which is again a pretty good boon in my book.
And the final question from Tony John Ash. Why is white so exclusive?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm afraid probably a rather disappointing answer, but because it's so old, is really what it comes down to. That because it's always been aristocratic. I think it's been described as excessively ducal, which is not something that can be said about all the clubs. And so there's a certain sort of club of which really only Brooks's, Whites and Boodles, they don't have to have a website, because they're not looking for people to join. They simply perpetuate invitation only. So that's the only reason I can think, which I understand is not a very satisfying answer, but they always have been, and so therefore they still are. And that doesn't necessarily make it, of course, the most fun club. And it's like anything else in the world, I suppose. And I'd be interested to know if it's similar in the world of the sort of livery world, because I know there's obviously a very clear precedence marked out in livery companies. But it's much more fun to be a member of a club where you're comfortable and happy, and you meet very interesting people, rather than simply be a member of something because it's exclusive. And of course, it might be good for your ego, perhaps. Perhaps ultimately you might be less happy. So that's my observation on that, I think.
It's interesting you mention precedence, because naturally the stationers has the highest precedence of any livery company, and a number of people have said, is Sam a member of the stationers? What I will say to everybody is a conversation that we've had already. So I'm not going to put words into Sam's mouth, but all I can say is an application form is in the post.
Well, thank you very much.
I think if we can wrap it there. Sam's book is available at a discounted price of £10 plus £2.50 postage and packing, and can be purchased by emailing Lucy at events@stationers.org. And if I remember rightly, Sam has said he's very kindly offered to sign any copies that people wish to have signed. And if you wish to have a message to put in the book, then we'll kindly do that. While I have everybody's attention, if I can just say that on Thursday, the 20th of May, at 6 o'clock, we're going to have a cheese tasting evening. So we have 5 British cheeses, and we have a cheesemonger from La Fromagerie, who will take us through the cheeses and tell us all about them and how cheeses are made, and cheese making in the UK. That's at £34 per head, but that will give you enough cheese for 2 people. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and I'd encourage anybody who's not yet booked, if you wish to book, I book soon, because there are limited numbers. So finally, I'd like to say thank you very much to Sam for a very entertaining talk. As I say, his book is available, £10 plus £2.50 postage and packing. If you can just email Lucy at events@stationers.org. And so saying, I'll now wish everybody a very good evening and say thank you once again to Sam. So thank you, Sam.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you all very much for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure.